Okay, so we are beginning to see that we do have some choices and we can push back, if you like, but we're never entirely liberated from what we learn in our past, and in some senses, some of our core values will resurface very quickly. And again, if you've been on the street campaigning and you try and scratch under the surface of what somebody says, you know, what God said or whatever, and we'd die if we didn't eat meat and everything, all those kind of things. If you try and scratch under the surface of that, there's usually either nothing much there, or they'll just go back to core values. You know, kind of, well, my mum said, or, you know, you'll get a lot of interesting stuff. If you really kind of probe people's beliefs, you'll find, distressingly really, that there's often not much underneath. It's all on the surface. You know, you scratch there, and you'll find there's nothing much backing it up. Okay, as suggested then, perhaps the most frequent experience of social life is that of being free and unfree at the same time. Furthermore, while some changes may seem to be attractive, in practice some of those changes may be impossible to bring about. In respect to those changes which are actually possible, Bauman reminds us that even then, the change or the cost of change can be high and rather off-putting. So here then we've got a suggestion and an argument that some social habits become so firmly fixed that the expense of change may appear to be just too much to take on. There appears to be just a little bit too much to de-learn. We have a lot of established habits that we don't want to forget. They need to be forgot, but we don't want to do it, or it's difficult to do it. Therefore, as we age, making the break becomes possible. At the same time, it might seem impossible to us because we're stuck in our ways. It might seem unlikely. And so people do talk about a generation thing. Let's try and get to the children, because they're not fixed in their ways by now. And change, for some, will appear to be unattractive. Now this is one of the final ones, really, of this kind of general sociological stuff. And it's just another kind of quintessential sociological statement that I wanted just to make sure that we're engaging here. And Bauman says that the central question of sociology, one could say, is in what way, in what sense does it matter that in whatever they do or may do, people are dependent on other people? In what sense does it matter that they always and cannot but live in the company of, in communication with, in an exchange with, in competition with, in cooperation with other human beings? So again, this is another kind of suggestion about how entangled we are with other people. And for a lot of people, that matters to them. I was at Luxembourg last year for the Animal Rights Conference, and an old friend of mine called Brendan McNally, he was saying, look, it's okay, you know, even if your parents and your family, they eat meat, they go hunting, they support vivisection, it's still okay to love them, you know, because they are your family, you know, because some people feel the need to kind of completely make a break from that, and that's why you often get this issue of, you know, vegan communities almost who will only interact with other vegans virtually unless they can kind of help it, you know, that kind of thing. It's very difficult to do if you want to lead any kind of, if you like, normal life. So, what sociology can do for us, it can offer a different way of thinking about society. And in particular it does these two things, the first of which is the important thing for us tonight, which is identify the social in the individual and identify the general in the particular. And so that last one means that sociology has this ability to slide from the micro to the macro and back again in order to analyse things. So you can look at a family or some social interaction and then look back at society in general in a more kind of abstract way. In terms of the first one, when we meet individuals, they've got all the baggage of their society with them when we meet them. what we learn as children, the attitudes that we are taught, may always be with us. We might want to change, but shaking off the past can be quite hard. Now, social movements, obviously, are often about bringing about change. So we want to do something which this is saying is quite difficult. Being in the social movement is about bringing about societal change. Or we want to change parts of it. Some social movements want to change all of it. They want a revolution. Some people just want to change part of it. Being in the social movement also changes us. The people in social movements change. And that means sometimes they can change so much that they have difficulty talking to what they now regard as conventional, orthodox abusers, whatever, because they've changed so much that they've kind of left the rest of society behind, if you like. So, social movements transform us. The idea about social movements is that we are looking for transformation of society, but they transform us as well. In some senses, the key to it is to understand that this complex situation is what's with us while we campaign. While we try to talk to other social animals, human beings, in terms of our values, we've got to understand that they're bringing a whole lot of their own values with them, which contradict what we say, even if there's not much behind it. And then, from our point of view, we also need to realise that there is that safety in numbers issue. You know, I've been on many a public forum, you know, discussing this, that, and the other, in politics.ie, for example. And people can write things there in defence of animal use, and they literally make no sense. And yet, a lot of people pile in and go, "I agree with John. I think what he says is right." You know, and you're thinking that doesn't make any sense. It's the fact that there's a safety in numbers thing there, you know, which they're relying on. Okay, so this is the more interactive bit, if you like. I'd like some kind of comments, if you will, because we're going back, really, in terms of what was said. This is kind of like the least of the interesting things for us. But we've got this manifold webs of interdependency. So we have to realise that, you know, the people that we're trying to influence are going to be people who are experiencing this just as we are. And one mistake that animal advocates seem to make, especially those who find changing easy, is they often expect other people to be able to change just as easily as they did. And you can often hear that, you know, on Facebook or whatever. Well, I changed, so everybody else can change, you know. I did this, you know, get a backbone, you know, what's the matter with you, and all this kind of stuff. And in some senses, they're kind of ignoring the fact that other people are finding this change and this embeddedness into their own social norms and their own families and their own communities, etc. They're finding it quite difficult to do. And it's no kind of mistake, really, sociologically, to understand that usually the biggest animal rights groups are in urban places rather than rural places, and larger places rather than small places, because it's those smaller places which have got an even harder hold on people than elsewhere. Let's move on to the next one, see what we can make of that. Okay, so this is the repetition thing. Now, I'm just wondering whether you've experienced this idea, because when we go up to people and suggest that they are doing wrong, we're suggesting that they've been making moral errors for years, you know, and that just because their family say it's okay, just because all their friends are doing it, and just because it's advertised on the TV every night, and you can see it in every Hollywood film or whatever, it's still wrong. We're challenging something, yeah? And they can use all of what they know about that issue against us. Because we're saying, well, look, we're all doing it, you know. Safety in numbers. You know. Anybody experienced that? I mean, I certainly have. Yeah. Anybody got any examples, maybe? People said things. I mean, we did a pay-to-view And Irina here found one person very kind of challenging because he reckoned he worked in a slaughterhouse for a time. And it's interesting because, again, this thing about not having to make sense is he contradicted himself, but it didn't matter to him that he had, and we didn't even get the chance to say. Because at one point he says, well, we're not that cruel anymore in Ireland. In fact, we're quite gentle the way that we kill animals now. And then, within about 2 minutes, he was saying, well, animals don't feel pain. In fact, you can stand on it, and it won't feel pain, you know. And so that begs the question: well, why suddenly has the system got all gentle then? You know, it didn't matter that he was contradicting himself, because normally that value would never be challenged. You know, and we see that, which is why people come up sometimes, and they are quite taken aback. You know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people here have had the experience of being on the streets with people, and some people can be quite taken aback. And what they will often do as a defence mechanism is be quite dismissive. Oh, I'm not listening to that rubbish, you know. And one great thing for them, especially if you're on a stand or a stall, is that they can walk away, you know. And so when they start losing the argument, or they're kind of losing, you know, it's getting a bit shaky, you know, the foundational thoughts are starting to be challenged, they think, oh, I'm not having any of this, and they'll walk away, you know. And then the only thing that we can hope for is that we've planted a few seeds, you know, and that's the way it is. So this thing here is that when we're familiar with things like eating meat and, you know, using L'Oreal or whatever, then there's no problem. Everybody else is doing it. What's the problem? Now, if there was some problem, something would be done about it. You know, the government would do something about it. And there's one issue, which is a really kind of ironic one, where the animal welfare groups, like the ISPCA, are kind of used within this construct to suggest to people that what they're doing is okay. So I'll tell you how it works. ISPCA is to prevent cruelty to animals, right? So what people do when they're in the supermarket, they pick up a piece of meat in their foam thing and they put it into their bag, and they know there's no cruelty in that piece of meat. Why? Because the ISPCA exists, and their job is to prevent cruelty to animals. So if there was any cruelty to animals, then that wouldn't have been on the shelf in the first place. That's what they can tell themselves. You know, it's quite a usual thing. But also, that's even if they even question themselves in the first place. You know, so not only have they got that first thing about there's no problem here, they've got that second thing about, well, I know that because, you know, the groups would have done something about it, or the government would have done something about it. Right, a couple more. This idea of the group making people, and the idea of changing. So we must have all known people who say things like, I'm sympathetic to you, but I can't change. You know, I can't do it. And there's quite an interesting thing in the vegan movement now about vegetarians who often say that about cheese. Cheese seems to be the big thing. So there's a lot of discussion about the idea that cheese is addictive, you know, because of this casomorphine in it, which is like a chemical compound which effectively adheres the infant to the mother. And because cheese is such an unusual product, what you've got is concentrated calf food. I always call milk calf food because that's what it is. So you've got concentrated calf food, and you eat it in a big block, so you get a lot of that into you, according to some people. And that means that cheese itself can be quite addictive, you know. But I've known people for years and years and years saying, you know, it's just too hard, I can't do what you do, or what you've done. Which is often why, another distressing thing for me, I think, is that when people say, oh, you know, you're so brave, or you must be so strong, you know, and that is such a useful thing for them to say.
Or
it's kind of like, yeah,
you're so disciplined.
You're disciplined, yeah, kind of like, you know. But they're saying, that's great for you because you're strong. I'm weak, I can't do that, I'm off to McDonald's. So it's a very, socially, that's a really kind of convenient thing to give somebody else that compliment. Oh, you're so strong, you know, You've got such self-discipline that you can be vegan, you know, like, it might be a mad idea, but you could do it because you're so strong. And then, of course, the negative version of that is, well, you could do that because you're so fanatical, and you're such an extremist, you know, and that's another way of pushing people away, you know. And so we've got all these kind of defense mechanisms which we use all the time. There's a whole kind of series of them, you know. And this is, I think it's, in some senses, when I give this talk, people think this is a bit depressing because it's suggesting that our job is very hard. Well, I think there's some truth in that. It's not just a question of giving somebody a leaflet and that's it, you know. Although, of course, we all know people who say, well, I got a leaflet off somebody and bingo, I was a vegan next day, right? It tends not to happen with most people, as we know. In fact, leaflets are interesting because most of them end up on the floor and stuff like that, you know. But you know, the fact is that because we've done it doesn't mean that a lot of people will do it. You know, they've got all these social mechanisms, and they're all conformists. And then this is that question that we need to ask ourselves. We've got a leaflet, and you hand it to somebody. Why should they take it?
Because it would be rude to just say keep it.
No, but what? For what reason? I mean, like, I made this point in my PhD. If people think about animal suffering and slaughterhouses, you know, as Roski says, houses of slaughter, for a nanosecond, they're going to think, there's probably going to be a lot about that I don't like. I certainly don't want to read about it, I don't want to see it, I don't want to watch a film about it. There's probably going to be a lot about that that's going to make me it's going to make me feel uncomfortable. And here's somebody giving me that knowledge and going, go on, take this pain, go on, take this pain. So, in that kind of social psychology, we've got to ask ourselves, what induces them to take it, you know? Now, obviously, you can get grander ideas, like, for example, one citizen giving another citizen a leaflet is one of the basics of democracy. So they should take it for that reason, you know? So don't get me started on those chuggers people, you know, who completely wrecked that entire system, you know? It's like, people now, I mean, in the 1980s, people used to come up to us to get a leaflet, you know? Now, you try and give people a leaflet, it's almost like, what explosives in that, you know? What kind of poison's embedded into that thing? Because they're expecting you to try and sign them up to, to Amnesty International or something, you know, or concern. So they think that you want their money, you know. But going back to this then, we are really socially saying that, swim against the tide, and in some senses, the people in this room have done that to various degrees. We've done that. We've broken free of that, and we are swimming the other way to some degree. And, don't be surprised if there's elements of uncomfortableness about it. Particularly, and this is a sociological point, particularly if the people that are most unreceptive are your family. A lot of people, I see this on Facebook all the time, I can't get through to my family, my family won't listen to me, blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff, and it really distresses them. Now, interestingly, sociologically, that's kind of to be expected. In some senses, talking to them might be the hardest people to talk to, because when a stranger comes to you and go, oh, I've got an argument, what do you think of this? You're just listening to the argument. When a family member does it, you've got all the family baggage and everything with it, and all the rest for years and years and years. So that changes the fact that you're not just receiving information. So sometimes, it's not that the family member won't change or anything, it's often the fact that, in some sense, it's the wrong person trying to interact with them. Sometimes a stranger would be better doing it than that. So the cost is off-putting. And then I think this might be the final one. This is our slide of hope, I call this. Our slide of hope, which is that it is true that we're very locked down when we're in primary socialisation. We don't have much control of our lives. We're in our little families and everything. But then, very quickly, things do change, and you do start to meet other people, and that our choices do become wider, and then, you know, we can, depending if we're willing to pay the cost, we can make change. And that is an interesting thing, because I've written a blog entry which is called A Numbers Game. We are still in the pioneer stage of veganism. So we now, our generation of vegans can still regard themselves as pioneers. We're still in the pioneer stage. We're 1–2% of the population at the most. And then, if you want, you can then start splitting them up, ethical vegans, and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the argument about if you're not an ethical vegan, you're not a vegan, it gets a bit complicated. So it's a numbers game. Our job, I think, is that if we build the foundations of veganism as a social movement and make it the moral baseline of the animal rights movement, then we're building a strong foundation for the vegans who will come in after us. And the better that we build the foundation, the easier it is for them to erect the structure on top of it. And the more slapdash we are at it at this stage, the more work those people who follow us will have to do. And I tend to think of it as that way. So, you know, people can change. And when the numbers grow, then change will be easier and easier and easier until it gets to the stage where it's the norm. I mean, that's the idea. A vegan world would be that veganism is the norm. But it would take that build-up. If you think about the number of plant-based foods that we've got available to us now, even in Ireland, I know that the range of things in Ireland is not as good as elsewhere, but even in Ireland, and especially places like Dublin and the other cities and everything, it's quite big when you think about it, and they're catering to a very minute percentage of the population. If that got to 2, 3, 4, yeah, and then they started to think there's some incentive here to do some research and development, R&D, you can just imagine the explosion of vegan stuff that would come. So that's why it's a numbers game. So that's why if people are pessimistic or thinking we're still small, nothing's changed, most people I know, are not getting it and all that, we still have to believe that there are vegans out there, and we need to hope that there's enough of them to make some substantial change. So we're all vegan pioneers. And so if you want to read about that, there's I've got a blog site, and it's called Hello Donald. In other words, we're all Donald Watson. Okay, does anyone want to say anything so I don't have to keep chuntering at you?
I would like to say something, because it might also give everyone hope. I'm not a vegan yet. This made me consider it very much, actually, but that was not the point.
It's my point.
Well, yes.
That's the only, I do mine when I came, actually.
So what I was going to say is, even while not being a vegan, I don't eat much meat, milk, any of that. And even just by living that way, I'm infecting my friends. I don't even talk to them, but they start to cook vegetarian meals and think about how much milk they use. And it's really nice, because I'm not even promoting it at all. So that just by living your life, you already change the world. And I think that's a fantastic thing. Yeah,
it's interesting that. I mean, I wonder... I mean, I know the answer to this from one person very much, but in terms of, do you think just being a vegan or a vegetarian is actually campaigning?
Yeah. In some way, it's not enough, but yeah, it starts. I think in some ways with our family and neighbors, it's more efficient than trying to convert people.
Because they ask you questions and then you answer.
No, it's just like she said, just by being a vegan and being there, they start to think about that, and it's more efficient than going toward them and
so how do they find out you're a vegan in the first place? How do they find out? I mean, people know, because I was around this.
Yeah, well, with the family, at first we have to explain just a bit, of course. But then, once they are used to, it's not by telling them, or you're doing wrong, you should eat less cheese, you should eat less, see how I'm healthy, etc. It's more efficient just to act, they see by themselves without the need to say them. You see what I mean?
Yeah. It's interesting, guys. I know for a fact that Bernie is sat behind you there. It's kind of like, she sees it the other way around, don't you? That veganism just comes from campaigning. That's how you see it, isn't it?
Well, I feel
you can go vegan and, well, back in the 80s when I went vegan, I sort of went vegan and sort of, I was vegan, but mainly the campaigning was against the separate issues. Like I sort of still do, I suppose. But now, veganism sort of is as much of an issue as all the other issues together. I know I separate them, and I know you don't. We don't really see eye to eye on this. I see the real campaigning as helping the animals right now by trying to change some of the legislation, some of the atrocities that are going on. Whereas Roger sees the issue as, let's even get one vegan this month, and that vegan won't do any harm, and that's nearly more productive than the other way of campaigning. But I think we need both.
Yeah.
I think going vegan is not enough. You know, I get into trouble for saying that, but I sort of feel going vegan is not enough. You have to do more than that. Get out with the placards, get out and save animals.
But
now.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm always interested in your perspective because it's as though.
Because you can't shut me up.
No, there is that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you do know my phone number, which was a mistake. But you know, like there are a percentage of vegans who become vegan, and then they don't campaign in your eyes, right, or your thing. And then, but you know, veganism itself doesn't preclude people campaigning, which is the odd bit. You know, like it's as though you're almost like expecting a certain percentage of them to say, "Okay, I'm doing my bit now. That's it." Yeah. And so.
Well, you see, I suppose a certain percentage of us older campaigners, I hate to say the word older, but we're not teenagers anymore, but a certain percentage of us, like probably Brendan McNally that you mentioned earlier, I know Brendan, he would feel, get out there on the streets and sort of, you know, there's so much stuff going on, like the abuse of horses or the turkeys on the turkey farms, all the things that are going on just right now. They need to be addressed because you can't ignore them. That's more the reason. They're so bad you can't ignore them.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think that campaigning for veganism is not ignoring anyone in that sense. But I take.
Well, we feel there's an awful lot of bun eating. Like, I don't go for the bun eating, right? Let's all meet up and eat buns.
I think
You
that's
know,
I think that's
vegan
really
buns.
one of the reasons that the VIP was formed is because our focus is the public, and the idea is to get out there in people's faces with the vegan message. And the interesting thing is that until very recently, I mean, this idea that veganism is now the moral baseline of the animal rights movement, it's quite controversial because it never was fully accepted, and there are some influential people who are kind of sliding back from that now, like people like Melanie Joy and stuff. So that idea, you know, has not been taken on. But there's some of the worries about campaigning for veganism is the fact that people are scared of the name. So we kind of wanted to test that out with VIP. We had a 16-week residency in Temple Bar. We had a stall there all day on a Wednesday for 16 weeks with massive vegan signs: Vegan Information Day, Why Vegan, Vegan Information Project. You know, it wasn't a question of sign this petition to save the whales, and then you know, you sneak them a vegan leaflet. And it was very kind of open, you know, because in some sense we wanted to kind of test that hypothesis that veganism is a scare word even in a place like Ireland, and we didn't find it at all, did we? We found very many people open to it. I call them vegan curious, you know, and you know, people are doing that, and we're now starting to get lots of reports about people who wear these kind of things and vegan badges and everything, that people are kind of coming up to them, asking them questions about it because they see the word, and they also are kind of quite curious about it, you know. So I think you can marry the two, obviously. I mean, I'm a vegan campaigner, I think, as opposed to just a vegan advocate or whatever.
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, I never made any secret about veganism, always on radio and all the rest of it. I was asked, they knew out straight what I was. But a lot of people do, like Nuala on primetime took the welfare stance to
Is there anybody who thinks that's a good tactic to actually not...
lie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I agree with Jurowski about. He said, I'm not a politician, and I think it's difficult. You know, like, there was one guy gave a lecture at this year's Luxembourg thing, and he was saying, effectively, you don't have to tell people the truth, you know, because you are not the audience. So in other words, you can do this kind of Nick Cooney thing, the foot in the door thing, and it's almost like, oh no, we don't want you to go vegan, it's just meat-free Monday kind of thing. But really, you do want them to go vegan, it's just that you're not going to tell them that, and then you kind of let them in a little bit at a time type of thing.
It doesn't work anymore. Years ago it might have worked. Back in the 80s
Yeah.
and 70s.
I just wonder if anybody thought that would be a
But
good
now
idea.
the hunters, the vivisectors, they all know the agenda, and the agenda is really veganism.
Yeah, okay, and that's
So-
why you get that, yeah.
So it's silly to try and say,
Yeah.
oh no, we just want to end fur, but we're not asking you to go vegan. That's silly. They can see through it now. It doesn't work.
Okay.
You have to be honest, I think.